Okay, so now let's take a look at some specific examples and use those specific examples of decolonization to be able to, by the end of this lecture, step back and see if we can't discern some broader trends. And since I've been mentioning India, that's a good enough place to start. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that when Western powers claim territory, they very often arbitrarily draw lines on a map to say, this is ours. And those lines, while they sometimes take into account geographic features, very rarely think about the type of people who are living there, which means that oftentimes colonies incorporated lots of different groups of people who didn't get along or didn't see themselves as somehow unified, or sometimes they divided people on one side and another side of a border. In the case of India, this is particularly true because before the 20th century, very few people there would have identified as Indian. They would have seen themselves as being from a particular region or from a particular caste or from a particular religion. But over time, with British presence, this concept of unity and the concept of being Indian slowly develops. And we've already seen that by 1885, there's the creation of an Indian National Congress that at first wants to kind of work within the British system to improve the conditions in India itself, but eventually becomes a bit more radical and lobbies for independence. We can see those two different approaches in many ways mirrored by the composition of this Congress. Early on, it is a Congress that is very much led by elites who are Western trained, but later it opens its doors to a wider variety of people, many of whom don't have such a Western mindset. Both world wars play a dramatic role on India. A little bit later, I'll talk about the number of soldiers who fought from India and died in World War I and World War II. But one of the things that Britain claims going into the war is if India supports Britain, then Britain will introduce a bunch of reform in India and basically make that area much more autonomous. And in that regard, they fail. They don't live up to their promises of reform, and instead there are a series of violent acts of repression against Indian dissidents. At the same time, they don't support India economically. There are famines. Europeans help introduce the massive influenza epidemic that the Indian health system is not able to support or to address. And it's kind of in all of this messiness that we see a couple of different main ideas developing. The first is nonviolent resistance, very much endorsed by Mahatma Gandhi. He is a British educated lawyer who calls for independence and unity among the different groups of people that live in India. The most obvious divide was between Muslim Indians and Hindu Indians, who see religion in very different terms, and that spills out to conflict between the two of them. But Gandhi, in many ways, is able to unite them against a common enemy, in this case, the British Empire. He uses basically what he calls nonviolent non-cooperation, advocating things like marches and demonstration and boycotts of British goods to more or less make it more difficult for Britain to keep India than to divest itself of it. On the flip side, there is this notion that the Congress, or the Indian National Congress, which evolves into the Congress Party, they have plans for a large state that is going to be represented by the people who live there. And because the majority of people in India are Hindu, this would be a Hindu majority state. This All India Muslim League that calls for that is very much pushed back against by individuals who see their rights or their attempts at autonomy or nationalism that would not support their group of people being quite problematic. And Muhammad al-Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, calls for something slightly different and calls for the creation of a Muslim majority state to protect the rights of Muslims in India, what becomes Pakistan. So in some ways you can see unity against British oppression, but you can also see the fact that one of the legacies of colonialism is now you've got a bunch of people who think and act differently in the same boundaries, trying to contest and compromise with each other, or trying to create even more independent nations. What ends up happening is by 1947, there is partition. The British decide to divide India into a Hindu-majority India with a Muslim-majority Pakistan on either side of it. One of those becomes Bangladesh eventually. And in the year of independence and division, again 1947, we see some big catastrophes. 12 million refugees, Hindus living in the area that's going to be Muslim or Muslims living in the area that's going to be Hindu, moving from their hometowns, moving from east to west. And probably 1 million of them die in communal violence that's related to this. Gandhi himself is shot by a Hindu extremist. So even after colonialization ends here, we still see legacies of violence as a result of it, and probably as a result of British mismanagement over the course of 90 years.